Hi, welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be discussing arguments made by this guy. This video can be found on the Capturing Christianity channel, so you can check it out. His name is Frank, and I'll be addressing this video to him. Hi Frank. I watched this video on your discussion about evolution and noticed quite glaring errors, along with a lot of assertions being made that were unjustified. I just wanted to respond to a few claims you made and explain why you should probably do some more research on the topic. I will start with a few assertions that you made. You said, even if macroevolution was true, it still needs a mind behind it. You said other things like the natural process itself is guided by a mind, the natural laws require a mind to even exist. These are just baseless assertions that have no evidence to support them whatsoever. When we write Einstein's equations or chemical equations, there is no reason to include a mind within them. They function perfectly fine without that assumption. A follow-up to that is that your opposition to theistic evolution is a scientific one, so you claim. But this would require you to give scientific evidence, and you have not provided any. It seems that you're trying to insert your God into the equation, then claiming your reasons are scientific when you don't understand the actual science. You mentioned the Royal Society meeting called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, where about 26 speakers on various topics, but typically on recent discoveries in biology and genetics. You say this was a challenge to neo-Darwinism, the basic mainstream view of how evolution occurs. Some of the claims made are yet to be substantiated, or to be substantially influential, and some have been known for many years. None of them refute the modern synthesis view. In fact, most of what was brought up was refuted at the meeting itself. You mentioned epigenetic information, and it is very clear based on your analogy you don't understand what it is, and even Cameron was capable of challenging your incoherent position. This forced you to admit you don't really know what you're talking about, and that Stephen Meyer was the expert. Clearly you also don't know the definition of expert. You then decided to pivot to other things that you think are wrong with evolution. One is that artificial selection has limitations. This is due to the genetic material we are dealing with, but also the environmental limitations. Considering humans took the wild wolf and evolved it into over 300 different breeds of dog, ranging from 4 inches to over 3 feet in height, in just a little over 10,000 years, it shows that these limits are not absolute and can be broken over time. Your assertion that we cannot get larger or smaller dogs when we are constantly getting larger and smaller dogs shows that you don't really care about the facts. You then questioned if our minds cannot break these limitations, then how could an unintelligent process do it? Now, I can leave it up to Cameron to explain why questions aren't arguments. But firstly, natural selection is a far more brutal force compared to artificial selection. Although it takes a longer time to see results, the environmental context is not sterile, and therefore allows for more impactful changes such as increasing in size. Let's take, for example, the elephant. It's a very large-sized creature that wasn't always that size. Its ancestors, around 60 million years ago, were about the size of a Great Dane, and they also didn't have trunks or tusks. Around 40 million years ago, the ancestors were closer to the size of like a large cow, and they did have the beginnings of like a trunk and small tusks. 20 million years ago, we then see sizes similar to like an Asian elephant with fully sized trunks, and there were a few different variety of tusks that these extinct animals had. At that time, elephant-like animals were probably the most dominant mammal on the land, as they had spread throughout all of Africa, Asia, and Europe. In fact, their domination continued until around 60,000 years ago, when early humans became efficient at killing many large mammals. Although early hominids began this technique with the invention of tools and spears at least 500,000 years before that. The reason for the large increase in size for elephants is those many millions of years many millions of years is due to the environmental factors such as predators, the plains and the watering holes they inhabit, the climate, and the migration to different regions. None of these things impacted our breeding of dogs for the last 10,000 years, and is not likely to have an impact in future. The fact that you could even equate these two things and call it a genetic limitation just shows how little you know or care about the facts of evolution. Cameron then pushed back by simply bringing up one of those factors, the time difference, and once again you bring up something else. You then mentioned Richard Lenski and his 32-year running experiment on E. coli, and that in all those generations he still just has E. coli bacteria. You bring this up in the same way that Ken Ham cites this experiment, to the point that it would be laughable if it was not just sad. Lenski himself said that the main thing we learned from the experiment is the confirmation of how efficient adaptation by natural selection is. The amount of evidence for the core mechanics of evolution that this experiment gives is overwhelming, with insights into rates of mutation, speciation, and antibiotic resistances, among many others. Considering all of the E. coli cells on average doubled in volume, and when some had evolved to feed on a completely different food source, the population size increased many times over. This would be equivalent to getting humans to feed on tree bark and having them evolve to be able to gain substantial nutrients from it that they outpace all other humans. Not only that, but the experiment was able to unfreeze early populations, effectively rerunning the clock, and the same adaptation occurred 19 times. By definition, E. coli are bacteria that do not feed on citrate. That is how they differentiate them. So if the bacteria that had evolved in this experiment can feed on citrate, then they are no longer the same E. coli. So you need to misrepresent the results of an experiment in order to make your position sound more plausible. You then go on to the cosmological argument, to which Cameron once again brings you back to the topic at hand. You then pivot again to instead ask another question. What natural laws can produce information? The answer is very simple. It's chemistry. DNA and RNA are made of chemical compounds, and combined with phosphates and sugars linked in chains, create information. The chemical compounds are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, and these letters A, T, G, and C make up the alphabet of DNA. These chemical compounds are made from very abundant basic chemicals like carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen in different combinations. Now, your example was English words written on a beach, but we don't have anything equivalent like that message in nature. Cameron tried to play devil's advocate and did a poor job by saying the explanation was random or it just happened. But that is not the explanation at all given for DNA or a cell. These things are not irreducibly complex. They are made up of chemical compounds such as nucleic acids, proteins, glycans, and lipids that we see in nature and can reproduce the building blocks of these in the lab. All that is required is for these basic building blocks to be formed from the Earth in close proximity so they can interact, and over time with enough reactions form even more complex compounds. Some of these compounds are capable of containing information and replicating themselves. Others interact by forming three-dimensional versions of the replicator's information. Some of them act as catalysts or structures to keep the chemical reactions contained and helps with energy storage and regulation. Eventually, the efficiency, stability, and cooperation between these chemicals is sufficient enough that they form a highly functional structure known as a cell. This entire process seemed to take about 300 million years, but this was just the formation of things like bacteria and archaea. It took another 2 billion years of further development of these two life forms before eukaryotes evolved out of them. Generally, this is seen as a type of fusion, where smaller cells become endosymbionts of a larger, more structurally rigid cell. Some of these endosymbionts use oxygen to make energy for the nucleus host, giving a huge advantage to survival and leading to the ancestors of animals, while others are additionally capable of photosynthesis, becoming ancestors of plants and algae. This is what we call an explanation. Saying that you can't understand how information could arrive naturally is not an argument, it is a fallacy. You then went on to discuss the fossil record and the Cambrian explosion. Both of these are incredibly easy to explain if you follow the science on them. Firstly, new fossils are being found all the time, and we already have a significant amount of transitional fossils for all major shifts over time, from fish to amphibians to land reptiles, from dinosaurs to birds, from early mammals to all current living mammals. Not too sure what fossil record you were looking at, but there are plenty of fossils that fill in these historic details, and not a single fossil that falls outside of that understanding. In terms of the Cambrian explosion, there is significant evidence that the major factors causing more variety in creatures during that period is based on several things. Firstly, the period before the Cambrian had little to no predators. Most creatures would gain nutrients from the environment, and some grew to be quite large relatively. Most creatures were stationary or had little movement, and had soft bodies without the need for any exoskeleton, legs, teeth, or eyes. If any predators evolved with such an easy prey to feed on, their growth in size and population and variety would be substantial, and they would fill out all kinds of niche roles within the food chain. The evolution of harder materials for legs and teeth, and also harder shells for defense, began to emerge even before the beginning of the Cambrian. These creatures that could move found increasingly effective means of escaping predators, such as faster movement or hiding beneath the surface of the sand, where they in turn found more nutrients to feed upon. The large-scale adaptation of eating other animals is probably the most significant event in the history of evolution, and it happened about 550 million years ago. The evolution of vision also played a large role in allowing prey and predator to increase the arms race of speed and tactics, of camouflage and strength. Whenever there is an increase in the amount of senses that a creature can use, the survival ratio goes up. Vision is probably the most important sense that creatures have today, and the first creatures to gain such an advantage would spread rapidly. There are other factors that could have also influenced the Cambrian explosion, but the last one I will mention is the oxygen levels. There was an increase in the oxygen levels of oceans around 250 million years beforehand, as well as some smaller increases in between those events. Some evidence support that there was also a slight increase at the beginning of the Cambrian, but it does not need to be a huge increase to similar levels by today's standards, as some scientists had previously thought. Considering a lot of these creatures were quite small and populations were not that large, only a small amount of oxygen was needed to allow for this rise to occur, and some evidence suggests that there may have already been enough before the Cambrian anyway, since the previous animals and sponges needed oxygen. So I don't think this was a sort of driving factor for the explosion, but enough oxygen is necessary for these types of life forms to exist. I hope this highlights the difference between an actual explanation based on the evidence and a question of how could all these phyla come into existence instantaneously. When you equate 40 million years to be instantaneous, when you don't look at the evidence in the scientific papers, from the fossils themselves to the environmental conditions, it shows just how little you care about the truth and more about pumping out these outdated one-liners. The discussion then moves on to the definition of atheism, and it's quite clear that you don't understand the difference between that and agnosticism. Now, I will try to explain this by responding to what Cameron said. He asked two questions and then a follow-up. The first is, do you believe that God exists? The answer, of course, being no. The second question is, should your beliefs be proportioned to the evidence? The answer, of course, being yes. His follow-up, however, is actually a bait and switch by saying, well, what's your evidence that God does not exist? If the first question was instead, do you believe that God does not exist, then the follow-up would be more accurate and it would not be a fallacy. When I proportion my beliefs to the evidence, and there is no evidence for a God, then I don't believe in a God. To put it in the simplest possible terms, if there is no evidence for something, then I don't believe it. It's so incredible that someone could be debating these topics for decades and yet not understand the basic concepts held by their counterparts. Then the discussion descends into the topic of your book and was basically just a few assertions, misrepresentations, and questions. There was one question that I would like to give some insights into, and that was, why should we be able to reason about things outside of our skulls? Now, this seems to be an important foundation of your book, and you discuss this further on, but the answer is very simple. We have senses that allow us to input information into our brains, and our brains are capable of analyzing that information to make calculations and determine outcomes. We then attempt to verify these outcomes with the scientific method, making future testable predictions and making sure that those outcomes are congruent to reality. Your example of it being similar to a fizzing Coke can, or a branch of a tree growing, or even a moist robot to a lesser degree, does not take into consideration the entire field of neurology. But even if our brains were entirely made from copper wires, gold plating, transistors, silicon chips, hard drives, etc., and we can still process information, then it makes no difference what that is made of. Just because the process that made those brains is biological and neurological does not change the ability to make the calculations or analyze the information. After watching this discussion in its entirety, it's not just evolution that you need to do a lot more research on. There are so many instances of you not knowing what you are talking about, or completely misunderstanding or not caring about what the opposing arguments are. Well, I hope this clears up the misunderstandings of evolution and other topics. If you have any questions, then I'm sure you can find a way to ask them. Thank you for your time.